Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically Gabriel Soma, the survivor from the brand new chapter, End Transmission. When I covered my mixed feelings on the Singularities lore in my last lore deep dive video, I described the chapter and its storytelling as very tropey, where its inspirations in sci-fi horror on its sleeve, and for the most part managing to build something fairly unique out of the components borrowed from the classics of genre history. This sadly struggled to bring us an interesting killer though, at least in my opinion, but Gabriel on the other hand stuck out to me as a potentially very interesting character with a ton of implications his story has for the wider universe End Transmission has created. That doesn't mean his story is entirely without its issues, it really isn't, and I'll be going into that later, but it's definitely an interesting one to look into properly, so let's do that. I was starting out by covering Gabriel's story and talking about its problems before going into why I like it so much despite them, so let's get started. Gabriel Soma was created on the cloning hubs on Proxima Centauri C, the colony world established by humans in the 22nd century by the Huxley Corporation. Proxima Centauri C, which is a real exoplanet that orbits the closest star to the Earth, was a major linchpin of Huxley's mission for the galaxy. Colonize distant worlds, strip them down for resources, and use them to fuel a cash-strapped Earth after a nuclear war almost wiped out humanity. Gabriel was created as part of Huxley's grand plan to stamp the company logo on the depths of space, specially grown and conditioned to be an engineer on the Dvarka colonization project. The clone workforce of the Huxley Corporation is created and conditioned to perform specific tasks in operations in deep space, and Gabriel was given the knowledge and skills to be an engineer for the mission, but he didn't really know that he'd been given them. Because while Gabriel and everybody else in the mission are clones prepared to be part of the crew, they were implanted with false memories of growing up in normal lives to give this emotional stability when they're out there on mission. Gabriel arrived on Dvarka with 9 other human crew members and a small contingent of machine helpers, 5 unmanned drones, and 5 Hux A7 robot units to help with the grunt work. The Toba landing site made the planet look very promising. Breathable air, tons of wildlife like Mildred, the cute little rock spider, just look at her, made it seem like the Dvarka colonization team would be in for a fairly easy mission setting up here. And the world even had alien ruins that Huxley scheduled for demolition. Boy, it'd sure be a shame if sending robots into the ruins willy-nilly to prepare them for demolition, instead of sending in humans to study and investigate them properly, was to backfire in some way. Things started to go wrong when Michael, the mission security officer, and Sarah, a science officer, were out exploring the wilderness when the transport vehicle they were in started acting on its own, driving at full speed off a cliff and the brakes not doing anything. Michael shot out the transport's windows and Sarah jumped to safety, but he wasn't so lucky. And the first of 9 human deaths on Dvarka began in a ball of fire and smoke as the transport was blasted to bits at the foot of the cliff. The crew mourned Michael's loss, but a far worse fate was awaiting them that night when the habitation block they slept in found itself with some atmospheric issues. The air was vented out the sleeping quarters and 6 of the crew were killed. Gabriel escaped by forcing open a door with the last of his waning strength, and Dimitri the medical officer saved himself and Sarah with an oxygen tank. The crew of 10 people were now only 3, but the unseen threat was not done with whittling down the numbers. Sarah went off on a reconnaissance mission with one of the Hux units, only for her communications line from the wilderness to go dead out of nowhere. Gabriel investigated, finding a brutally mangled and dismembered corpse missing its head. When he went back to check the records, he found evidence that one of the Hux units had gone rogue and killed all but one of his fellow crewmates. That Hux unit had just returned to the base, and it wasn't done yet, having taken Sarah's head back to the lab and begun to extract her DNA to construct a new flesh body. When Gabriel realised what Hux was doing, he doesn't begin to try to understand why, which is probably because Hux's lore showed us that not even the writers know Hux's reason for doing what he's doing. Anyway, Gabriel's finally wise to what's going on and decides to do something about it by confronting the Hux unit with the intent to disassemble the bucket of bolts before it does any more harm. But Hux proved too strong. It's only when Dimitri arrived to provide a convenient distraction, the Hux to pull apart like a small child with a paper napkin, that Gabriel managed to escape with his life, running into the wilderness of Dvarka while Hux perfected his design. It was only when its new body, a hybridization of flesh and machine, stepped from the cloning bay that Hux recommenced its pursuit of Gabriel, tracking him down with ease and pinning him against a wall. Gabriel struggled to fight back, and managed to send Hux reeling by blasting a hydrogen fuel tank open before he left Hux to perish in the flames. But Hux did not perish, and as Gabriel squeezed the smoke from his eyes, he saw the burning, screaming monster stagger from the wreckage. The machine lived, and it was pissed, setting back on Gabriel with the vigour of an angry god. But before it could catch him, Gabriel found himself surrounded by a dark fog, and before he knew it, he wasn't on Dvarka anymore. And thus the entity claimed Gabriel Soma for its own. If you've watched my video on Hux or just read either story yourself, you'll see that Gabriel's story is largely a retelling of Hux's from a different perspective. A more personal and human one that has more time to explore both the context and the other characters in the setting. While I started out talking about the successes of Hux's story before going into its failings as its lead character, I'm going to start off talking about what I didn't like about Gabriel's story, before exploring its lead character and why I think Gabriel is a very compelling new survivor with a ton of potential for interesting stories in its upcoming tome. There are two parts of Gabriel's story that let me down upon rereading it for this video. The treatment of Sarah, the story's only female character, and the dumb decisions made by both the characters and the writer that puncture the story's believability and shatter suspension of disbelief. But before I go into them, I'm going to put a really big however on screen now, to remind you of the fact that despite these issues, I still really like Gabriel as a character, as a reminder for you to hold your horses in the comments a bit. First is a relatively minor gripe, but it's a really irritating one. Sarah the science officer suffers from many of the problems behaviour has historically had when writing female characters. 4 of the 10 members of the Dvarka expedition team get named appearances. Sarah and Gabriel obviously, but also Michael the security officer and Dimitri the medical officer. Let's go through Sarah's appearances in this story, shall we? She appears once at the start of Hux's rampage where her life is saved by Michael after Hux hacks the transport. She appears later again when Dimitri saves her life after Hux vents the air out of the barracks. And her third and final appearance is when Hux finally kills her and takes her head back to the cloning lab. Sarah makes no decisions, does nothing of any consequence, and literally just exists in the story to get saved by the male characters who've been named until she's killed off in the most gruesome and brutal death any character gets in this story except maybe Dimitri. At least the other named characters all get to do something. If nothing else, Michael saves her, and Dimitri not only saves her but also takes on Hux himself. Unsuccessfully, but it does buy Gabriel time to get away. Sarah's entire presence in this story is as a damsel in distress, and it's a really sad fate to relegate the story's only female character to. We just come off the back of some really fun female characters who do plenty in their stories. Talita, Skull Merchant, Haddie, and the Michaela tome all feel like great steps forwards in how behaviour rights women. But Sarah just existing as a device to be saved by male characters or brutally killed when there's none around to save her feels like a massive step back that this story did not need to make. Maybe we should do something in the tome, I guess. It just sends a pretty bad message that the only named character who's just a damsel in distress existing to be saved by the other characters, and does absolutely nothing else, is also the only named female character in the story. The other part that gets on my nerves about Gabriel's story specifically is that it takes the dumb decisions that Hux makes during his story and applies that layer of idiocy to everybody else too. Hux's story suggested, at least to me, that the disasters that Hux caused that killed most of the crew left no survivors of any of the attacks. Meaning that every time Hux went on the warpath, he was going after people who had no idea that anything had gone wrong on the base, leaving them totally unprepared for the danger until it was too late. Gabriel's lore, however, indicates that both the transport crash and mass decompression of the residential area had survivors who escaped them alive, meaning there's no way that they couldn't have known that at least something was wrong. Sarah reported back that the transport accident that killed Michael happened because the brakes didn't work. The doors locked themselves and accelerated itself off a cliff, which, you know, could reasonably be an accident and not foul play, but that's the kind of thing that the expedition's engineer, you know, the thing that Gabriel is, should really have checked on afterwards to understand what happened. After all, even if it is an accident, investigating it further to look for some sort of technical flaw could prevent it from happening to anybody else. And if Gabriel had checked the servers to find out what happened, he'd have seen that Hux was behind it, because that's how he finds out later that Hux has killed 7 more people. Right, okay, Gabriel missed it, we all make mistakes, and that's excusable. But then it happens again, because the ventilation breaks and 6 of the 9 crew members are suffocated, and now we have a major problem on our hands. There are only 3 crew members left, Gabriel, Sarah and Dimitri, and everyone else has died in mysterious circumstances in the past 24 hours, and they've decided to carry on the mission as normal as if nothing's happened. Sarah goes off for recon on her own like it's just another day at the base, and Gabriel doesn't even think to check the main server that apparently has all the technical activities logged on it until she goes missing. And the thing is, the transport and life support system records are on that server because that's what Gabriel uses to find out about them later. So you'd think Gabriel would have checked it before when those things first broke, rather than waiting till now, which leads you to think he probably just sucks at his job, because if he had checked, he'd have learned Hux was behind everything, and the lives of everybody else on the base could have been saved. Like, either Gabriel is a dumbass for not doing his literal only job of making sure the tech works properly and working out what to do when it doesn't, or the writer's a dumbass because they didn't think about how Gabriel would actually act, and just needed a reason for him to find out what Hux is doing late in the story rather than earlier. But I think my favourite stupid thing in this story by far is how Hux killed the 6 people in their beds in the shelter, because the writer of this story has made an absolutely amazing cock-up. The crew members died because they had no oxygen, it says so here, implying that Hux disabled the ventilation system and the planet's lack of breathable air caused them to choke to death. Except on multiple occasions, Dvodka is explicitly confirmed to have breathable air. It isn't that Hux can just turn life support off and let the atmosphere suck out the breathable air, because the air outside is breathable. So how do the humans die in their sleep? Yeah, humans will die if they're locked in an airtight room for long enough, but that takes days. Certainly not fast enough to kill you in your sleep. They die of thirst or dying of asphyxiation at that point. Hux would have had to actively remove the air himself, something that a ventilation system, even a futuristic space age one, just isn't designed to do. You can't just put the fans in reverse. You have to create a vacuum chamber the size of a large room, and that's really hard to do, even with specialist equipment, much as a ventilation system designed to keep people alive. Like, I get that it's science fiction, it isn't meant to be realistic, but if the world you're creating and the story you're telling relies on stuff that just doesn't make sense even in that world, then you've lost me. It snapped me out of the experience of reading the story, and if it didn't for you then, like, cool, so be it, but it just didn't work for me. All they had to do was have Hux flood the room with exhaust fumes from the spaceship's engines or something, and it wouldn't have been an issue. Like, the fact that the Doctor Who episode about the alien space police rhinos dumping a hospital on the moon somehow got it more right scientifically than this story should say everything that needs saying. I don't know, maybe Hux had an air rejuvenator on hand for just such an eventuality to let him create a vacuum chamber with the snap of his fingers, but it shouldn't be on us as readers to make the writer's story make sense for them, to compensate for their own poor writing choices. I'm just exhausted covering this stuff, because I want to get onto Gabriel as a character, but if I don't highlight these profoundly stupid storytelling decisions, then they're just going to get missed, because, let's be honest, who else cares enough? But yeah, Gabriel's story at its worst is borderline unreadable with constant dumb decisions and a stunning inability for the writer to remember how breathing works, pulling you out of the experience of reading the story if you're really paying attention to it. Much like Hux's story, Gabriel's story is rough enough around the edges to force you to skim read it if you want to really enjoy it. However, the best difference between Hux and Gabriel's stories is that Gabriel as a character actually works really well despite these issues, to the point that, unlike Hux, I'm actually kind of looking forward to Gabriel's tome, and there's a pretty simple reason for that. More than any other survivor, Gabriel plays around a lot with the role of the action hero, and for a game with so many survivors being generally good, upstanding people, it's surprising how little we've ventured into that territory before. Hattie's probably the closest we've gotten to a proper action hero, being an adventurer who explores the horrors of the world and documents them for her web series, and her body is covered with scars from the battles she's won and the monsters she's survived. Gabriel is our first survivor to physically fight back against his own killer. He stands up against Hux in physical confrontations, first attempting to disable it and then using a hydrogen fuel line to nearly blast the damn thing apart. It's far more dynamic action than we'd normally expect from survivors, and that fits with the chapter's themes and inspirations. The chapter is based heavily on sci-fi horror works like Alien, Predator or Terminator, are typically heavier on big budget action set pieces than you expect for the genre. For a smaller scale, more intimate killer like Michael Myers, it doesn't really do to have huge action set pieces very often, and when they do happen it's often to showcase the villain's power, so the eventual standoff with the hero is more climatic because of that smaller scale. They're alone with the monster and it's all about tension that's been built up over the course of the film. A sci-fi horror villain is typically more powerful and often less psychological in the nature of its threat, so action set pieces are going to be more spectacular as a result, especially because the monster could have very specific weaknesses due to its nature as an alien or machine or whatever that our lead has to exploit. Gabriel resorts to direct physical confrontation while other survivors who know their killer, like say Yun Jin, don't, because the psychological relationship between Yun Jin and Ji Woon generates all the tension it needs to by itself, so that a physical confrontation would be distracting and clash with the story's themes of corporate greed and Yunjin's dubious morality, allowing Ji-woon's evil to manifest unchecked. Hux, on the other hand, is a grander threat than Ji-woon. He's more physically powerful, more completely homicidal, and less psychologically engaged with Gabriel, so a physical clash between the two is inevitable. It's a fight for Gabriel's survival against Hux's ambitions. While there's a nice little homage to the history of sci-fi horror as an action genre in disguise half the time, the action-packed climax of the story isn't why I find Gabriel to be so interesting as an action hero survivor, but rather as an unlikely action hero, and one that draws the Huxley Corporation's entire philosophy and method of operation into question. Gabriel is a clone designed specifically to do a particular job on his mission, just like everybody else on the crew. Huxley did not consider his free will or future when conditioning and brainwashing him for the Dvarka mission. He's a tool to do the job for them and nothing more. This makes him a pretty good thematic mirror to his killer, because both were tools of the company designed for a particular purpose. Hell, Gabriel being designed to be an engineer puts him even closer to the robots than his comrades. But that isn't inherently what makes Gabriel's role as an action hero so interesting. It's the fact that he wasn't really supposed to be. Because again, he was an engineer, and ultimately not meant to punch or explode his problems. If anybody was meant to do that, it was the mission security officer Michael, who was Hux's first victim in the transport crash. If there was a technical fault, it was Gabriel's job to handle it with a technical solution, rather than just, blowing it up. But by the time Gabriel realises something's wrong with Hux, it's far too late to just find a technical solution to the problem. Gabriel displays a level of quick thinking and flexibility that makes you forget he's effectively a tool of the company, and it shows something that a company like Huxley might not necessarily want: freedom of thought. When trouble breaks out, Gabriel doesn't call for backup from the company or attempt to preserve the company's property. He fights for his own survival first and foremost with any tools at his disposal. He's more Ripley and less Ash, even though he was effectively built like Ash. This becomes doubly interesting when you realise that cloning is a key part of Huxley's operations. The entire crew was comprised of clones who didn't know they were clones. The cloning hub seemed to be designed to create more to populate Dvarka fully, and it's likely that cloning was even a key part of rebuilding the human race after the nuclear war towards the end of the 20th century. Huxley poured tons of money into it, and became a major power player as a result, to the point the fact that they're able to manage their own interplanetary society by themselves, if the descriptions of the legions of manual labourers produced by Huxley are anything to go by. This leads to so many interesting questions. How much free will do these clone workers have? Are they like Gabriel and don't know they're clones? It's clear that cloning is to some degree common knowledge since Dvarka is being built with cloning hubs, but if they do know they're clones, then what does that mean for their free will? Can a manual labourer clone, study mathematics and become a scientist? Do they have the freedom to choose a better life for themselves? And what will Huxley do if they try? There are lots of readings of Gabriel's story that indicate that Huxley has effectively brought back institutionalised slavery, as it creates people conditioned to do a particular kind of work for them, and heavily restricts the freedom these people had to do what they want as a result. This leads to even more questions. Are clones well known enough to have their own legal distinctions allowing Huxley to treat them like this? How much of the human race is made of clones compared to natural-born humans? And does this influence legal or corporate policy? What happens in the event that clones refuse to participate in the system? A clone rebellion, so to speak. Huxley is implied to not be the only corporation of its size and power either. Do others like them treat clones in the same way? Whether or not behaviour has even thought about this for more than 4 seconds, the world Gabriel lives in and his role in it offers a myriad of questions and considerations that make me really want to see more of this universe. There hasn't been a world since that of the Black Veil that has really interested me in terms of the potential places its story could go, quite like this one has. To explore this world of human cloning and conditioning of the population in full, to see what it has to offer when the concept is accepted more completely and goes from being just a part of Gabriel's backstory into the central theme of its own story. Imagine, for example, a world where gladiator games are brought back and clones are conditioned specifically for performance in the fighting pits. Or a black market for harvested organs is created, taken from imperfect clones rejected by Huxley and discarded. Maybe there's a group out there that takes advantage of clone technology and attempt to breed certain traits out of the human gene pool, effectively building a eugenesis movement out of cloning on an industrial scale. As a horror game, Dead by Daylight is very well positioned to explore the worst and most fucked up possibilities this world has to offer, and allowing a soulless corporation to build an interplanetary empire on the back of an endless supply of warm bodies custom built to be cogs in this vast machine opens up so many possibilities in the future for new sci-fi stories in this huge, uncaring new universe. And none of this would be possible without Gabriel. While the details of his story itself can be very messy in places, the fundamentals that his character sets up for the universe opens up a laundry list of possibilities for the future. And his relationship with Hux and how he breaks his programming effectively turns that list into a phone book. Maybe one of these days we'll go back to the grisly empire of misery Huxley and corporations like it have inflicted on the galaxy, with their near limitless power not just through money and influence, but through control over life and death itself. And if we ever do, we'll have Gabriel to thank. End Transmission was Behaviour's first trip into proper sci-fi horror, and it's been kind of a mixed bag when it comes to quality. Some elements of Hux's motivations were clearly undercooked, and some story beats really needed some polish, so the sheer absurdity didn't break you out of the immersion. But the atmosphere is superb, and Gabriel's backstory provides building blocks for future stories in a genuinely exciting, unique and complex sci-fi universe. Maybe Behaviour hasn't fully considered the ramifications of their storytelling decisions they've made, both the good and bad ones, and I guess we'll see when the tome comes out how true that is, but in the meantime, I find myself rather liking Gabriel. He's a fun character, decidedly different from the kind of thing we had before, and regardless of my foibles, I can't say he's not a breath of fresh air. Nice, breathable air. Well, I hope you enjoyed my video on Gabriel. What do you reckon? Are you excited for his tome coming in the mid-chapter? Do you not care? Do you think I'm being too harsh? Let me know in the comments, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Sorry for being gone for quite a while lately. I've been off viewing flats and preparing to move. And while I was gone, I know that my Megan video has been blocked worldwide now, so no one can see it. Guess I'll just re-upload it another time with some changes to try and get past Copyright Monster this time. If you want to catch it or any of the other exciting videos I've got planned, be sure to subscribe, hit that little like button, the notification bell so you don't miss the next upload. And if you really like me, consider joining by the Patreon. I got so much scripting done while I was gone, so I'm ready to upload some cool new videos, and I look forward to getting them out to you. Guess until then, I'll see you around. Ta-ta for now.